Welcome to the Readings on Race Book Club, and proud for our 10th anniversary of the book club. A little over 10 years. We actually got started in January and February of 2015. Okay. So at any rate, we have kept on through the pandemic, through many things. And some sad days from the House members, and there's some happy days too. A few potlucks, right, Dorothy? And so on and so forth. But we're really glad tonight to partner up with Proud, who was able to bring us our author from this book, Radical Atlas of Ferguson, USA. And we'll get to that in just a minute. Talk a little bit more. I just wanted to point out some things to you. On the table over here, we have a lot of the books that we've read, but not all of them. So I think we really need to feel proud of all the books we have read. And, you know, we started with The New Jim Crow. That was the book that one of our founders, Carla Fletcher, our dear friend and late Carla Fletcher, she wanted to read that book. She wanted to read it with people, and she knew she wasn't going to carry a sign out in the street at that time, so we started reading, and wow, we've read a lot. We've always had, these have been our commitments when we've been together, how we were going to interact with each other and what we were going to do as part of our discussions every month, and to make sure everybody was heard and could participate and so on. On our back table, I hope everybody got a name tag, and if you'll leave it behind for the next time you come, that would be great too. We have a picture of Carla and a few artifacts from through the years and our ribbons that we made at the time when she passed. And so if you'd like to have one of those, please do. We'd love to have one too. I've been thinking about her a lot, so I think she'd be real happy there. We were still reading and still reading, and you know, learned a lot of things through the years. And we'll have refreshments a little later, but the thanks to everybody throughout everything. And thanks to the library for the lovely cake. So at any rate, we're just really glad to see you and thinking back on these 10 years, all the things we've learned and read and talked about, and so. I also want to, if you have not met him, we have one of our Ferguson City Councilman here, Jill Franklin. I think we talked about when we had our discussion about this book, if we go to the city council and the mayor and the city staff read this book. It's really interesting. So at any rate, thank you. I just can't say enough for being here tonight. So I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Patty Heyda, the author of our book tonight from Washington University, and she's here to tell us about her book, tell us more about it, and then we'll have time for questions too. And you know, we always try to kind of honor that 7:30 stop point since the library closes at 8, and but you know, they're usually pretty understanding. We'll go a little bit longer. We'll try not to. Okay, Dr. Heyda. Okay.
I have some prepared images I thought I would just kind of give the context of this book. I'm assuming not everyone in the room has read it. So I hope it's not too repetitive, but it kind of situates like how I have come to see the world. I also want to thank very much those of you from this Proud group and those of you from the Readings on Race group. It's an inspiring group. The fact that you've been doing this for 10 years, all of these organizations are really quite inspiring. And thank you to the Ferguson Library, which is in the book. I don't remember if I have it in my slides or not, but I can pull it up. That ballot measure that was spearheaded, I learned today, by Carla, is actually one of the drawings in the book that under the category of mobilizing, which is the category of things that we are doing well, that we should keep doing things like that. So I'll see if I have that in here. So I don't want this to feel too academic-y, but I will give you the spiel a little bit. This book is the product of, so I teach at WashU, I teach architecture and urban design. So I'm really just a designer, that's my disclaimer. And I see the world through drawings, and drawing and mapping help me to understand what's going on in a place. So that's partly like, why did I create a book of 100 maps? And this is a book of 100 maps that look at North County. Really, it's called Ferguson, USA, because it's kind of coming from what the rest of the world knows as Ferguson and the events that happened here. But it's looking at the situation of St. Louis and North County as emblematic of American cities more generally. My research at WashU is on American cities. So I'm interested in the history of American cities. I look at issues of inequality and how that hits the ground in American cities, but I also end up looking a lot at St. Louis because I'm here. I've been here for 20 years. And I'm happy to answer questions. The title is called Radical Atlas, but I think to me, it's not radical at all, because it's really 100 maps of everyday tools. These are like everyday planning, like planning incentives and instruments that policymakers use, or practices that governments rely on, or it's kind of like a map, an atlas of the everyday ways we make cities. And it's based, and so let me just explain why I think that's useful, or how I'm trying to look at what I think a lot of people already do and know. Maybe that's the radical part, is to kind of try to see a place we all know through a new lens, to try to like step back and look at everything together. So it's kind of this delaminated kind of like different maps, and each one is calling out a particular tool or a particular kind of city planning issue. And it's trying to present it through the lens of Ferguson, which is, as you all know and lived through here, what the rest of the world sees Ferguson as is the events of 2014. And I don't take this lightly. This was a young man who was killed in your community, and I really do. I don't take it lightly. I'm aware of, even using Ferguson in the name of my book. Like, I'm not trying to disparage Ferguson. I'm not trying to use somebody's life and their name as for some academic research or something. I just, through my courses, have learned a lot about the way the city works. And I just felt like I was sitting on all of this body of work and all this data we collected with students. And it just seemed like, well, maybe I should share that, and we can have conversations about, what all the kind of intricacies are that underlie a place like Ferguson, like Berkeley, like Calverton Park, like Kinloch, even Clayton, right? Like these underlie our cities all around us. So the book is kind of set from 2014 to today, and it came out last year at the 10th anniversary of Ferguson, and a lot of people are asking what has changed. And so the book kind of starts with this story of the Ferguson Boys and Girls Club that was built, because there are like really visible markers of investment that came after the uprising here and after the events. And this is one of them. And of course, slow changes to leadership. I know you guys are debating, there's a whole thing ongoing with the consent decree and other things. But my point in focusing on the Boys and Girls Club is because on the one hand, this brought a needed resource, in my view, to an area that was sort of very under-resourced, a part of the city that had not seen investment. But when I zoom out from this as a designer, I see like a street that has really unclear, unsafe sidewalks, and there's no shade. It's like extra hot to walk down a street like this. It's very unsafe for pedestrians. There aren't that many crosswalks. This is a neighborhood that does not have robust transit, which means more difficult access to jobs, access to health insurance, and access to better funded schools. Of course, those are schools that might offer the kinds of resources that that Boys and Girls Club offers, right? So I'm looking at the case of Ferguson as a way of understanding, okay, how do, in this case, all of the region's big, wealthiest corporations and companies, they are helping fund this Boys and Girls Club project that does bring needed resources, and it really does help, right, kind of supplement other things they're missing. But meanwhile, these companies are benefiting by and large by policies that are growing their wealth, that are taking away from like schools that might, if the schools were well funded, for example, we may not need a Boys and Girls Club building. So the book is looking at the underlying kind of structural, what I call what, not just me, but what has been called structural inequality that really is behind the scenes, not just in Ferguson, but everywhere. And it's just pronounced here in Ferguson. Of course, you all know where we are, right? So I don't have to go on about that. But kids who go to the center, of course, they leave and they return home to the same situation they were in. So while there are amenities at the center, it's not solving the kind of broader underlying issues. And I say that as a way to also, there's a kind of argument in the book that's about philanthropy. Not that, the city of St. Louis has a lot of major foundations that have given to the city. It's not that those are bad, it's just that they are uneven and unpredictable. Like where they're gonna give is fine, but you end up with a kind of undemocratic way of making the city if you're only relying on the foundations to make the city. And of course, those foundations are like I said, they're funded by major companies that are benefiting that, by some of these taxes and other systems that kind of maintain their own relationship to power. So here's an example from the book. And some of the maps in the book are more complicated than others. My husband is not a designer, and he was just like, oh my God, you are putting a lot on a map. So the book is trying to offer different levels of engagement, and some of the maps you sit with longer and you really have to kind of read through, and other maps are showing less, maybe just two sets of data next to each other that you can make a correlation. But I'm also showing this because this is the St. Louis region that we're not all always used to looking at. We don't look at maps of our own home because we know the way to go. But this is and so you'll see this shape in drawings I show, but this is the city, and that's St. Louis County, and of course, North St. Louis. So this was one of the maps in the book that, just to make the point about philanthropic efforts that make the city, it shows the shading in the background is showing you the population density, like how people are spread out in the region. And you can see it's kind of even, minus the hole out there by like Wildwood, where it gets hilly. You can see the sort of density is fairly even across the city, but then it's overlaying all of the, when you go in Google and you search the maps for everything that had empowerment, youth, or boys in the name, this is what comes up, and it's all concentrated in North St. Louis. So on the one hand, that means there's support coming here to the region, but on the other hand, you could read it as a kind of a meter of the structural deficiency. Whereas, you know, and then the shaded area are the schools that have a rating of C or lower. So, you know, you can start to see the schools that are funded don't have these empowerment centers. So this is just like a kind of a example map that's trying to make a point about to get my readers to think about how are we making the city, and is this the right strategy? Is it working? Okay, I'm gonna jump to this drawing of public policy, and I'll try not to be too jargony, but this is a really important, it's a timeline, and it's an important graphic in the book because it sets the stage for what has happened in this country, not just in Ferguson, but in all American cities. So again, that's my broader background, is looking more generally at American cities. So it is a timeline. I don't know if you can see the detail from there, but starting in 1900 on the left, going to 2020, and correlating to the time are all these different bits of information. And the bottom, I'm not on the mic, right? Okay, so I can move around. So it's kind of inventorying some of the main like moments of public policy, because I come from a kind of a planning background. So these are like the big federal programs that were related to city making. And it's showing, it's illustrating this shift that's happened in how we have funded projects in the city from a more socially minded set of policies to what's become much more privatized and developer oriented. The correlating lines, this one is the line of disparity between the top 1% of wealthiest Americans and everybody else. So there was the greatest disparity at the Great Depression, 1929. During these social programs, this is what's called liberalism in American policy. During this time, that level of inequality went down, probably to the lowest point it's been in a while. And then from 1970s and on, we have this slow shift to have less top-down government, and now and that with that came like stripping of funding for cities. So cities have no money now, as you all probably know. And this idea that we're gonna let the market steer how we do development. And so part of this is to not give communities the funding directly, but to give developers money to do what the city otherwise would do. And you can see the level of income inequality has spiked back up, and this ends in 2008. So I'm not, you know, that would be a whole nother book maybe to look at what's happening now. The bottom one is the taxation on the wealthiest. And so when we were taxing the wealthy more, that was also part of this. And importantly, I want to point out the red and blue are denoting the political administrations. So it's not even about red versus blue, because you can see both political parties have participated in this over the last 50 years, pretty much. So this is an economic view that, you know, my background is not economics, but I found myself really drawn to understanding the background economics because it affects the policy, and the policy shapes the design, but also because it just seemed like this is the structural system that is part of the problem. And it's this kind of privatization, in my view. And so the book is looking at the city through this lens of privatization. It's trying to show all the different ways that not just Ferguson, but North County, American cities, like how they're influenced by private interests in ways that we didn't even realize. So it's trying to just like help us see what's really going on. And that's why they are maps to draw that. Also, just to point out, during that blue middle period, that is when, you know, what was called liberalism, that is when we saw funding for public institutions, the growth of like post offices and the jobs program of USPS, which went on to become one of the greatest jobs for minorities in this country. Social Security came about at that time. Even public housing in the US came about at that time. Moving into the kind of, you know, era of austerity, or the sort of, you know, where cities now had no money, that's what you heard of called neoliberalism. It's like the new way we're going to do it. You might have heard that term. This is like academic-y stuff. But yes, so instead of giving money to cities, we're going to put projects up to the market. We're going to let competition and efficiency drive making the city. The thing about this is it's geared toward a growth economy, like cities where there's population coming and there's businesses and industry and everything's growing. When you have Ferguson or St. Louis, you know, North County is what I call the first ring suburb, which means, and I have another map in here, let me skip to, the racial dot map of the region. The first ring suburb is another fancy term. You know, the city, like back in history, and the industry was all focused downtown, and then it grew outward. And the first ring is really this kind of immediate area outside the city line where the early suburbs were built. And this is like the 1920s. I think I have it in here. As the highways were getting built, we had a lot of this area becoming their own municipality. I feel like you guys probably know a lot of the history of Ferguson. And you can see on this little graph how the city population grew and then started declining around 1940, 1960 in here, and then how the county was growing. So what you probably heard of as like white flight. Anyway, these suburbs grew in that kind of time period as people were leaving the downtown St. Louis and other areas there. But what we have now, as you know, is a really chopped up regional picture. So these are all the tiny little cities that are here. This is a drawing showing the mayors of all the cities. And not only is the county a separate government from St. Louis City, but it is, you know, we have this kind of competition between all the little municipalities. So the book is trying to look at all of these things together. And from my view, we have a perfect storm that happens in North County, which is like I said already that big picture stuff of cities having no money, already kind of policy that's trying to steer through private developers to make the city instead of you know, the public sector having the capacity to do it, and a kind of changing demographic. So you all know the Del Mar Divide. It's become famous for like economic and racial divisions in the city. But what's happening here is a kind of maybe less division and more integration. There's a rich mix happening in North County, and there's also, of course, overlays of other histories of racism and other things that are compounded together with a changing demographic, a weak market, declining revenue, all of that in a growth-oriented set of policies. So it's incompatible. And that's what this book, every drawing in the book is trying to point out. There are these contradictions that are incompatible. And that's why there's so much emphasis on this kind of economic background, because I think it's a big part of it. Of course, when you have the incompatibilities, you end up with, these situations where they become really racialized, and you get forms of exploitation and this kind of predatory things that are happening. And I know you know about the tickets and fines and the policing here that has been called out a lot, right? That was really exploiting communities of color and profiting off of poverty. But those exploitations also exist in the built landscape. So that means there's also ways that industry and companies are trying to exploit access to land in this area that has these changing demographics. Access to cheap land, of course, being near the airport. There's a lot of dynamics going on. I'm trying to kind of simplify, but this is an image from Robertson, which was a significant historic Black community on the other side of the airport that was totally torn down to make these big box warehouses because it's right by the airport. So that's like the image on the left. And you can see the sole church that was left there in that image, which is here. And I found these signs like very striking. These are the signs in the parking lot of that business that are kind of unabashedly sort of celebrating the violence of this kind of development that in my eyes is really all about, it's this kind of struggle over space and place between these industries that are trying to get the access they need and the cities that in some ways are enabling it through incentives and other stuff. There is an idea that if you help the companies go here, then they'll generate the taxes and the jobs. And so part of some of the stories in this atlas, look at this. And, I think in one case, it's in the book, not going to remember exactly, but there were maybe 500 jobs predicted. And I think it ended up with like 50 or something. So it's sort of like, also like kind of auditing how are things actually playing out. That's a little bit about what these drawings are trying to do. All right, I don't want to take too much time. I have a couple more examples I can go through if you think it's okay on time. I put this one in here because when I talk about the tools or the planning tools or the policies, these are like some very concrete kind of tools that we can point to. These are like tax credits, redevelopment areas, TIF districts. So those are terms that are used in planning that are trying to incentivize private developers to come to areas where they may not automatically make a profit. So here we're looking at the region again, and these tools were invented like TIF is, don't worry about it's tax increment financing. All the names are
we know.
Technical. Okay, yeah. So like TIF is supposed to help developers invest in a declining area. And when you look at that map, you might think like, okay, all these incentives are here, right? We're doing that work. We're trying to get the investments here. So for example, the book looks at TIF, and it's the hatched part in the drawing. And you're looking at like so now we're zoomed in, the maps move around a lot. Now you're zoomed into the edge of Ferguson, and this is Kinloch next door. And it's showing these different TIFs that were here. And this is just to also illustrate how nothing is simple and it's complicated. And the book is trying to not oversimplify, to pretend that everything is black and white, but to actually try to really mine this complexity so that we can have a better way of getting into it and rethinking it. The critique that I heard, some of the critique that I learned about in Ferguson was that TIF went to the Historic Center, which as a designer, we should keep our historic centers like this. Like we need this kind of walkable fabric. But the argument here was like, oh, this is one of the most stable parts of Ferguson, and it's not going to where it's really needed. You know, bring a grocery store to the other side of West Florissant Avenue or something like that. The critique in Kinloch next door, which I think you all know Kinloch, it's again another super historic, the first all-black city in the state of Missouri that has been really destabilized over a long period of time. This is what the TIF produced in Kinloch. So in Kinloch, we have a 20-foot chain link fence with barbed wire, offensive industry, offensive meaning environmentally. I see that as a designer as like, this is not what we should be doing. And it's a food distribution center in a community in a food desert, no less. So these are some of the, oh, and here's an image kind of from the air. That's the Schnucks distribution center there. And there's other things about this, which include, again, from a design standpoint, you know, community of these tiny little homes, and then the scale of this big thing. You know, even if that fence wasn't there, it's not a community maker to put a huge big box thing there. Now, okay, so this is part of another larger story that has to do with the airport redevelopment, and more of that is in this book too, although I've written totally other stuff on it, and I'm happy to share that with anyone who's interested. But all of this is a way of just kind of starting to try to call out some of the contradictions that I'm talking about with, you know, cities that are trying to lure investment and create development, and communities that need other stuff, and all of those constraints that I described. And this slide is in here. This is an image from 2010 from Kinloch, and this is a way of just stepping back and saying, you know, if you live here, these are contradictions that people who experience this know very well. And my goal is to, I sort of think if we can map it, then we can give evidence to these things, again, towards these kinds of conversations. I have another random image in here. We're jumping now to Calverton Park, and I just threw this in as a way to illustrate also that some of the stuff in this atlas, it's not all about exploitation on like racial terms. Some of it hurts everybody, and it's more about like the suburbs and the way we built the suburbs and the way we made everything car oriented, and how, like, for example, in Ferguson also, I think it's over here, but the like there was TIF money to build up businesses along 270 up here. We're in Calverton Park now. This is McClure High School and 270. And this map is showing all of the shops and amenities that are at the highway, and they're the ones getting incentives because they want to build here because they're going to capture a regional audience. Meanwhile, you have these communities that have really low walk scores. You can't walk to anything that you really need. And the point of this is also to show out in Wildwood, which is median household income of $140,000, the walk score is 9 out of 100. So some of these policies are just need to be rethought, let alone the context of Ferguson and everything else that's going on. So that's kind of just a little side note that there's some other arguments being made in here about that. Okay, I'm gonna just very quickly show you what the book is made of. It's divided into sections that kind of give you smaller doses of related themes. So the maps are kind of grouped according to theme. So you could look in a section and go from map to map. There is a guide. So if you get lost, you can find your map number and see where you are in the region. Because like I said, you know, some of them are looking at the whole pattern, but others are zooming in North counties. You can kind of like check where you are. And there's also other context. This is across there's two spreads that like 4 pages, this timeline that goes. And this is again, a kind of a timeline that starts to add all these other policies. And so you can look at correlations. So I think that's an interesting, it's not a map, but to me, it's a way of understanding the context of time, what's happened over time. It's harder to show in a map. It's hard to see on this, but these are the moments of civil rights gains. These are the wars, the depression. So you can sort of see these major moments in American history relative to the rise and fall of St. Louis population, relative to the different policies that I see as kind of reactive to, you know, some of those gains. And then the little side story is also everything correlates to where you are in time. These are time going across. So there's little side stories that show the ongoing kind of income disparities in the US, even at this moment in time. It's a little blurry here, but so this is just how the book works. And I'll lastly say, here's the structure of 3 sample pages. And the way, if you are new to maps, you can read, this is always gonna just tell you, here's what you're looking at. This is gonna describe, you know, you're looking at data from this year and this year showing, you know, like for example, it's showing health asthma rates and something else, right? This is more like how to see it in the context of that other stuff I was talking about economically. And then because a book is linear, like maps there's so many ways you could package the different topics. So I created this like analog hyperlink system so that if you're looking at health and health disparities and obesity rates and who has insurance, you know, that's what that map is saying. This says see also, and it'll give you other maps so you can jump across to another section in the book and look at the food distribution, food deserts, and then it'll tell you to jump to this one and you can look at the economics of fast food and the strip. And so you can start to jump across the book. That's like what that is about. Okay, and then lastly, let me just quickly say, the mobilized maps are a way of thinking forward. So I think a lot of questions I get are, what do we do now? And we ask this in all my classes that we teach. So this is where it's highlighting what are the things that are good that we do, that region, you know, not just, you know, just regionally, some of it's coming from the state, some of it's coming from the city, but funding the libraries, for example, libraries and schools. The reason I think this is important is, like I said, like philanthropy might ameliorate like a little pocket of a city, but public schools and libraries are there for everyone, right? So again, you have the background shading is the population density where everyone is spread out. And you can see how evenly distributed public schools and libraries are to the population. So it's much more, I believe in the public sector, in that it is accountable and that it is, we just need to shore it up because it has no money. And this is the slide that speaks to the ballot measure, right? And that's an amazing story that it was brought really by you all, this ground up effort to fund the library. So these are maps that are talking about what to do. And we talked about polling places. I have this in here just because I want to illustrate some of the stuff I do in my classes. So again, here's Ferguson, not to go too much into this, but when we talk about who's voting, we can see in this ward, which is the where most of the lower income housing is, and where Canfield Drive is, where the protests happened. This is that there's no polling place in Ferguson on this end. But not only that, this is exaggerating that train line. So we have a creek and a rail, and there are physical barriers which are also part of the story. And mapping can show us that. We can read statistics, but if we see it on a map, we can start to oh yeah, it's like a wall, right? You can't cross that. So some of the ideas that I work on with students have to do with just thinking, what if? What if we really saw this creek as a public greenway that would provide access? What if this is mapping all of the parks in Ferguson. They were speculating on the Emerson property. One student said, what if we could blanket the Emerson property with solar panels? That would be enough energy to power every, I think it was every person under the poverty line could have free energy, right? I mean, there's a big investment, but there's a whole way of rethinking how we might, obviously who owns that? It's easy to say, right? But these kind of what ifs we can play out. And this is looking at the idea of this part of the city and how do we use the infrastructures we have to try to get access to voting, all the way to a student idea to create a new kind of a satellite public building right across from Canfield Drive on that east side that would serve as a community hub and an expression post and where people could vote, but also importantly, this is a project that would combine with the Boys and Girls Clubs and the Empowerment Center. This is speculative. We have no client. We're just designing. Well, meaning we did talk to people in Ferguson planning as part of our learning, but this is saying, what if we put this, at the end of Canfield Drive, and it's literally bringing in people to vote and onto the trail system, and it's about connectivity and some of these ideas. So this is a far off what if that I just thought I would end with. The mobilized section does not include that project because it came after the book went into press, but it does include much smaller moments of using design also to kind of reclaim space. This is the basketball court in Kinloch. All right, so that's it. I will stop. It's 7. Happy to take questions. Sorry, it was very fast. Yes.
Wow. In your mobilized section, you call attention to Action St. Louis and Taylor Reed. And Action St. Louis just led the effort in St. Louis's most recent cataclysm. The tornado response was not a public response. Marginally it was, but it was an Action St. Louis response led by private people volunteering and organizing and calling in. That's part 1. Part 2 is one of the very first ones you showed that is utterly disheartening, and I'm afraid it looks inevitable. The tornado will end up killing residential North St. Louis. Just killing. And I cannot see a privatized public policy as finding value in individual families having homes.
I know, and I
It's
should
inevitable.
say, the book has a whole inventory of a number of the big and small nonprofits that aid communities. So, some are more like political or politicizing issues, like some are, funding political campaigns, and others are like Action St. Louis was going door to door trying to increase the vote at the time I was researching this. So I'm not trying to say private nonprofits are bad. I'm trying to say, we need to be careful, like, and I actually, the drawings in the book actually show who's on the board of each of them, because I think if we can see what companies are investing in them, then we can start to understand
What they going,
how the priorities are getting steered.
yes.
So, they have a very small board. They do need money, they need money from private industry. So it's not that like it's evil to give money to a nonprofit, right? That's the system. That's what we rely on.
But they're not there for the long haul.
Well, and they're
They're
there.
there for the long
Yeah.
haul as an institution, but they can't fund buildings.
Yeah,
They
no,
can't.
and I mean, yeah, they have a limited capacity
I know.
for sure.
I know some, but there's no.
But it's interesting because they're working to actively increase access to democracy and to help people. Like we don't have I don't think there's like a community development, like a strong community development center, like so in my other research, I looked at other cities where there's like a CDC, like a single, and some of them have been in communities like in Opa-locka, Florida. It's also this very similar kind of story of this little town very close to downtown Miami. And it's largely African American, and it's like in the shadow of these huge, I guess, policies and big power players in Miami. But what was I going to say about that? It has this community development center there, which is sort of this nonprofit group that has been, for example, buying property there. And that way they can hold it. And after 20 years or 30 years, they started being able to redevelop it themselves. So it's not Action St. Louis isn't at that point, but some of these groups have been able to kind of like a community land trust or something like, and they're developing affordable housing and they're ensuring that this stays for people. So like, it's weird because it's almost like a overlay government, but they're not elected. It's just so American. Yeah, this way.
So, Patty, like you said, not just Ferguson, you kept emphasizing, not just Ferguson, it's happening in all the cities. And so when I got DirecTV, I was able to look at all the different communities all over the United States, and I see how prime real estate is actually in inner cities. It just hasn't gotten here to our area yet. And I see, I'm with Richard. I believe what Richard is saying, because the devastation that has happened in North St. Louis City, I see the beginning of gentrification. I just don't see it coming in and bringing all those resources in to rebuild those buildings back for Black people. I just don't see it. I think this is the beginning of the gentrification of St. Louis. I really do. Now, I'm going to ask, I don't want to put you on the spot, but like you said, you kind of like study, you looked at all the different cities, and I think you'll agree with me that a lot of these cities, when I used to watch HGTV and I used to watch all these people, the real estate was cheaper as they got further away from the city. If you try to find something in the city, it was really, really expensive, right? So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I got asked that question recently in a conversation. First of all, I think because of the airport, the land here is lucrative. Land around this area has become lucrative for developers interested in kind of global trade. I don't know if anyone remembers the China hub idea. That was part of the whole background of Hemlock, and we're going to be a point on these global trade circuits, and it's trying to capture an economy that we don't have. So there's a whole story as to why sites around the airport here are desired, by some of these industries, and also Boeing's already here, for example, and it's a lot harder for them to move than to just expand, or so there's stuff going on there. But in the city, Paul McKee, there's a whole area called North Side that has been cleared, and he wanted to put the warehouses there. So that was already happening there. I don't know why it didn't go through. I mean, he also had a major tip. Yeah, I mean, and then the whole, so there's another, but there is a neighborhood, Botanical Heights, which is like Freetown. And it's also a neighborhood that I looked at and I've written about, and I'm happy to send it. I'm no expert, but that is
bad. Used to be, it was so bad.
Yes.
And then they built, I call it gentrification, because they built those houses up, and your average person who used to live there could not afford those.
Right. So the city, and there's two phases to that. So one phase, they took down 6 blocks of historic register, classic examples of working class homes, beautifully built brick homes. 6 blocks of that got taken down, and they rebuilt this kind of suburban-y stuff. And then the other half, they kept what few were there, and they're infilling, which is a much better way to do it. But the critique is the new stuff costs, $200,000-$300,000. Somebody who used to live there is not able to come back. So, so how do we rebuild neighborhoods for people to enjoy them? I mean, I think that's the metric, and it is scary to think about, like the Ville with its history in North St. Louis, but there are other groups who have been working there, and they are also doing work, like I think for the Ville, which is one of these organizations. They were starting construction on affordable units. I mean, it's a lot of people left too, so it's also like a slow, how can people, how do you grow an area? Do you have to refill it with people to pay for the services, the taxes, or can we accept an area that has lower density, and how do we, it's like a whole nother way of thinking, I think, that we have. But, who's doing the thinking and how are they, I think it's like, oh, here's all this land, we need to clear it, let's make some money on it, right? Yeah, I don't know.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you look at the timelines and you look at ups and downs for the national and the local. So and I see there was a slight pattern in there. So my question is, just looking at projection, where would the region be going next, based on the fact that there's 13 families still run the region. They are all reflected in those in the businesses that you put up there, and and the level of racism. So where do you see the St. Louis region going? Does it mean you can't gentrify the whole area? Maybe other than to have big parks and.
Yeah.
I could
Yeah.
answer that.
Yeah.
So I guess the way I see it, city of St. Louis is being gentrified. The city already has a redevelopment plan for everything south of MLK Boulevard. The tornado probably will expand on that plan because a lot of North City is in disrepair. So now it's like, okay, well, now it's prime for redevelopment because we can force people out of their homes within the domain. What does that mean for Ferguson? Because we live in Ferguson. So a lot of the city's, poor residents are going to be displaced.
Right.
They've been displaced for the last 15 or so years to North County. That's why you see shootings, killings, all the things you see going on in North County now,
Right.
that wasn't going on in the 90s, is because there's a different element of individuals throughout the region of North County. So things will continue to deteriorate. And I think the one thing Ferguson has to do is, we have to invest in our housing stock. We have to make this a place
Yes.
where families want to buy,
Bye.
grow their family. If it's just a transient population that comes to Ferguson, then Glasgow Village, Castle Point
Yes.
is our future.
Yep.
And more people will leave and sell their homes while they still can get good value, and the community will decline. So that's kind of what we're tasked with as a community, is maintaining our infrastructure and making sure that you guys elect people that have that vision and see the reality of where we are as a community, so that how do we entice people to want to grow their families here in this community.
And transit and school are part of that.
Yes.
Schools are
Yes.
important, because that was the other part, in the
Yes.
city, a lot of schools closed, so that displaced people because they had to move out of those communities, because the schools closed. So,
It's been, housing tax.
Yeah.
And then there were no houses, it's a tax.
Property.
you know, I grew up in the city of St. Louis, in the West End community, which was a rough neighborhood growing up, the Cafe Ford Center. There were things that you just did not see in the city that today you see. Like, there was no Walmart, no Target, no Buffalo Wild Wings in the city. Now, Midtown,
Yes.
it's a paradise in that little corridor, and they're going to expand that to North City. Won't happen tomorrow, but it's, there it is. So it's
What I've noticed, I've done some research on this, and a lot of our little housing is being sucked up by investors.
Yes.
And not only do they suck them up, I mean, a lot of them, I can think of 4 houses that the same company inside of Las Vegas owes 3 years taxes on. And they don't even know for sure who owns these houses. 3 of them are vacant, one does have a tenant in it, but the company that has it has 120 properties in North County. And they're behind 3 years in taxes on it. Back of the envelope addition, that was a $500,000 in arrears property taxes. And I know it's not just that one company. And there was some laws that seem to die in the State House. And it's people, well, me and Mildred have known each other for years. I was her mailman for 7, 8 years.
Yeah.
The nicest houses in the neighborhood belong to African-American homeowners. The crappiest houses in her neighborhood belong to investors. And they haven't done anything to those houses in years, and they fall apart. And they're the houses that have been occupied by squatters.
But it's also that's a national problem.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's international, actually. You know, that more and more, I mean, I live in a fairly nice house in a nice area of, I mean, I bet weekly I get somebody wanting to buy my house. And I know more and more people in our little subdivision that are renters.
Yeah.
Because, and you can't find who the owners are because they're what, an LLC or something.
Yeah.
You know, and so, that's almost, I don't know, a national problem.
And there is a map in the book on large landlords, and it maps, for the big housing complexes, it shows where the owners are, and most of them are not in St. Louis. It's
Right.
Bigger complexes, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about community, but I want to tie it to the conversation we just had as well. You said that the big box stores that they built over by Kinlock are not a community maker. First of all, what are elements of community that we should pay attention to if we talk about housing? But broadening out what makes a community, because it's more than housing. We need roofs over our head. So that's part of it, and I'll tell you where I'm headed also. this conversation we just had really affects me personally as well. I've been here since 1997. I own a handful of houses here in Ferguson, but I hate these out of state. I hate it because it makes it harder on me. I've been here since 97. I'm committed. I'm staying. I only buy in Ferguson, and it's my home. Raise my kids here, but I agree. I mean, these are developers too. But back to what is community, and we need roofs over our heads, but it's our relationships. So I went to a week-long training some years ago, several times, called Peacemakers. That's a good part of what we need too, right, Joel? I mean, because, you know, there's leadership in the city council that can trickle down if we, you know, promote things like that. And January 2018, I went to city council and I told them, we need to bring 2 people to Ferguson, one Andrew Collins, a white cop who framed Jamil McGee for a drug offense. Why? Because it's going to help him be the top cop. But long story very short is both of them went to jail. Jamil unjustly, but Andrew Collins was caught stealing informant money and other things. And a lot of his convictions were overturned. Jamil got out of jail, but he lost 3 or 4 years of his life. And his son was born, he was going to sea when he got arrested. So, but the point I'm getting at is they both in prison. They were both in prison when they got out in some sort of work program called Mosaic. They forgave each other. And they go around the country now speaking about making peace. That's community, because we're always going to have conflict, always going to, it takes an effort to look at from the earth. You know, I'm in the North Pole, you're a South Pole. We've got to meet at the equator. It takes a lot of effort, and you want to heat at the equator. So what, I mean, so I'm saying family, you know, you have conflicts in family, but an emphasis on learning to make peace. And, you know, if you don't bury the hatchet ever, then you're always going to use it. So what, how does it, we talked about houses, but that's part of community, but gentrification, okay, we can't really stop it. Anyway, just, that's my favorite, anything you guys to say about what makes a community.
I think a key thing is public schools.
Yeah.
There is also drawing, I think, in the book right now, but I looked at it with students. So if you think about, and like what we call local anchor institutions, they're anchors because they are fixtures in a neighborhood, especially elementary schools, which usually have a smaller catchment area around them. So if you think of a public elementary school and a kind of radius houses around them, everyone who lives in the block surrounding the school, all those kids go together to the same school. The parents are gonna be in different blocks, they're gonna meet each other at the school. So you can start to build relationships and community through that geography of literally like the school and the blocks. And the kids are gonna live next door to the other kid, you know, that they go to school with. When you have, oh, there's a lot of hands, okay.
Yeah.
When you have this sort of like the district gets de-accredited, or you have these charter schools or other schools, then you have a block. And let's say this kid still goes to that public school, your neighbor might go to the private school over here, the next neighbor might go to this school over here.
Yeah.
They no longer meet each other, the parents no longer have that reinforcement, and you have a geographic dispersal, you have an erosion of the possible community that you can get just from that daily thing of kids in schools. I mean, that's one little example of how it really matters to have these local anchors. Churches play that role too. Religious institutions very much play that role. And in Kinloch, interestingly, all those churches remained. All the houses went, got cleared, and the churches stayed. I don't know what the negotiation was for that. Maybe some of you know the story. And people still come back from they're dispersed now all over the region, and they come back to go to church. So that idea of that kind of fellowship. So those are these churches are they're not public, but they are community. So that to me is very important. Of course, having, a kind of like, we talk in design about human scale, like what I mean by the big box, not making community. It's just at this huge scale. How do you even approach that? You have a distance of like 300 feet of parking lot with cars, and they're hot, and they make emissions, and there's nowhere for a person, and there's no trees, and where do you stand? Even trees, you stand in the shade, and you might like have an area to talk together. So it's just like physical environment can, it's not going to do everything because there's a lot of other stuff going on, but it's part of it.
I have to step away, but I do have a book recommendation. I can just send it online to the group.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's the name of it?
The name of the book is called Monster. It's an autobiography book about a former LA gang member.
Hey, Monster.
Thank you.
So much to it's bad.
Okay, there were a lot of other.
So where do you see Ferguson going at right now as far as the consent decree, the unrest that happened in 2014 that you you gotta talk about that. Of course, no, that's okay, but I'm just saying, as far as the elephant in the room, which you talked about in your presentations, as far as how Ferguson now sits in the universe, not just here in Ferguson. What do you see? I know everybody in Ferguson that has monetary investments in Ferguson, they want to see the consent decree gone because they figure that it's just about the process of it taking funds out of communities, and when they're forgetting the reason why it was actually formed, and not understanding that it's not about like checks and boxes. Hey, we got this amount of cops and whatever else, but are the people changing their mindsets in order to serve the purpose of what it's there for? So where do you see, because I know right now we're in a heat bed right about now, talking about how the city of Ferguson is removing funding for the consent decree in various ways. What do you see as far as the funding being removed, the community, creating the community, eroding the community's legal structure, as well as the governmental structure? Where do you see Ferguson at with that being removed and not being executed?
So I don't know enough about what has been done. I think that would be an important factor to see what all has been done. I haven't seen that. I haven't followed it. I heard about this discussion happening, but I don't know the background. So, and I don't have a lot of that. I have Forward Through Ferguson in here because it started as a state, state appointed board, and then it segued into being a nonprofit. So, I didn't look explicitly at that and the tracking of that because there've been a lot of other reports and stuff that are looking at that. I don't know, except that there's a level of accountability that comes with having a consent decree. So if you get rid of the consent decree, then who's accountable, right? But that also has to do with how much has happened so far.
Right. Well,
I don't know.
Not just how much, because that's what everybody's looking at. Well, we've done this, we've done that, but it's not just about how much has happened. It's about is it a genuine practice?
Yeah. Do
Policy
we see the fruit of a new good thing happening, right?
It's not just a good thing. It's a humane thing. It's happening to where people get it within their genetics to understand that you treat people the way you want them treated, no matter if you're wearing a police uniform or not, and not just looking at the historical part of you wearing a uniform and saying, well, they're heroes in the community, but if the paperwork is not showing that you've been a hero and not protecting and serving people that you say you're supposed to, that consent decree has not been fulfilled. So you should have, like I said before, at the hearing, you should have a babysitter to tell you how to treat your people, citizens in your community. Not no overseer telling you, okay, do this, and he said, well, okay, well, I guess I will, but if I'm not gonna do it, you still need to take their money away. So like I said, with this whole presentation, that should have been the basis to me, it should have been the basis and foundation of everything revolving around it as far as what he just said about building community from that point.
So
We are getting close to 7:30.
Yeah.
So the lunch is out here. And if we have anyone last burning question that needs to be asked or comments, and preferably somebody who hasn't said anything yet. Because it's always been one of our commitments to the book club at any rate.
Becky, you had something your hand was up.
I was just gonna add to your statistics that when you said that schools that should be neighborhood anchors, Ferguson Forest a couple of years ago decided to have,
Yes.
school centers.
Yes.
You said brain centers so that the schools are no longer neighborhood anchors.
Right.
You have certain pre-K through 2 centers in 8 different parts of the sections. You have grades, 3, 4, 5 centers scattered throughout the district. So your anchors, your high schools can be your anchors, but your grade schools are no longer the anchors, and you have kids in one family being scattered all over the district.
You said you believe the public sector because it's accountable to who?
What?
Accountable to who? The public sector? You said you believe in the public
The
sector.
voters. So if you can go to the ballot and vote your local elected person in, if they are not delivering on what you hope for, or what you need, what you know needs to happen, then you can vote, right? That's the kind of way you can hold people accountable, so. Yeah.
I just wanted to tell you that I think this is brilliant. I really appreciate hearing you speak about the book, because for my mind, that helped me a lot to understand what the book was showing, which is so much. And I wish that you were on a circuit speaking around the United States, explaining this, because this vision needs to come about.
Right.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you for your comments. I'm still learning.
If you were gonna do add a map to the book, what would it be?
Oh, good question.
There's a lot of each map opens more questions. So it's just like this consent decree, right? Like, that's not necessarily in here. There is a map that shows tickets and fines 10 years later, and it kind of shows, okay, there've been some improvements. There's less of that predatory policing happening, but still more disproportionately African-American drivers. So it's sort of like the issues are still there. So there's just a little bit of that, but again, because so much has already been studied on that, I was just looking much more like, it's like a core sample, like it's a cross section, a little bit about each really different thing to just kind of open enough questions. So each map has a whole bunch of questions. That are like another set of maps that I can do. So one thing that I'm trying to understand more about is actually the Canfield Green apartments and the housing there. And I've started to do a little, I've just started, but it started as a swinging singles.
Yes.
1970s, like it was not like built as, low income. Well, it was like cheaply built. Part of this more developer mentality. Anyway, it's I don't know where it's gonna go. But I'm just
Does your book cover how many renters or in Ferguson as opposed to homeowners?
You
How
got it.
many?
Well, you got
It-
percent,
Yeah, it looks at renters and homeowners.
There's, okay,
and comparing it to other.
It looks at
municipalities,
eviction
too.
rates, it looks at large landlords, like they are more likely to evict as a way to get people to pay their rent. Versus a small landlord is gonna know the tenants and they're gonna just have a conversation. And you're more likely to just like, oh yeah, okay, pay it next month or whatever. It's much more like
okay,
humane discussion between a landlord and a resident versus the large landlords, they're not here. And there's a bit about that,
okay.
there's renters, there's a bit about homeownership and the tax benefit homeowners get, how the richer you are, the more benefit you get for the policy. It looks at, it just looks a little bit at everything. But I'd love to know what map I should do, please. Let me know what else.
You probably do have an ideal, well, probably,
Yeah, that's in there.
It is, I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
That's all right, that's all right.
I'll check.
Okay.
Okay, we could go on and on.
Yeah. Lots of.
so let me get to our,
Yeah.
and from crowd, I know, well, let me say the Reading on Race Book Club, you all are some awesome book club people.
Yeah.
And sometimes I talk, I might talk about race in various settings, but because of the work that this book club has done, they have upper level conversation than I will have with having the same discussion with other not as experienced. The experience shows in the conversation. Not putting other people down. I'm just saying their experience and having dialogue about race shows, and it's an upper level conversation. So I can really appreciate the work done. And again, Carla's very special to my heart. Carla Fletcher. Oh, the other thing I want to say is, so the book club has presented this book twice. Once on their own a couple months ago, and today. So this is Proud's first time, but I can see us doing it again.
Yeah.
We're glad So thank you so much.
Yeah.
I want to mention Carla Fletcher again, because we talked about her starting the book club and her being on the library board and doing things on the library board. But Proud has existed since 1995-ish. And we worked in the community till about 2010, because a lot of people lost interest and said, well, we're good now. Racial unity, we're good. We know what to do. And there was a lot of interest lost. And then after Michael Brown was killed, another organization came together, and that was One Ferguson. But that kind of, after a couple of years, it was sort of an emergency organization. So people just had to go back to their lives. And Proud reformed. And Carla was on that board that worked on putting Proud back together. So she was the lawyer who did our 501c, putting Proud together. So she's special to us too. So we just want to give a donation on the 10th anniversary of the Reading the Race Club of $100 to the Carla Fletcher Reading on Race collection.
All right.
To the library, Jesse. And so I guess
Let's have some refreshments.